We have two presenters for this session. If the third presenter might show up, but I kind of doubt it. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first session will be Richard Carrico talking about the Decolonizing and Reconstructing Kumeyaay village names. And the second session will be Matthew Crute talking about collaboration. I'm part of the work that Richard Carrico is doing, and we also have a linguist and a grad student that's working on our team. And what we did was we went back into the old Spanish records, and just to try to reconstruct a lot of their records. They have Kumeyaay names for places. They have Shimulls names, sometimes are clans, and it's hard to tell if they're referring sometimes to a person's clan or their village site. And so what we did was we went back and had to try to reconstruct or deconstruct and reconstruct what they wrote down from that time period. So we're looking at a type of Spanish that was spoken, back in the 1700s. So it's not like modern Spanish. There were priests they weren't all Spanish priests. Priests were from Italy and from Portugal and other places, and so they all had varying levels of fluency in the Spanish language, and so they were interpreting what they saw, and then they were writing it down, and then there was some variation in the literacy level of individual priests too. So as you can imagine, sometimes we found a huge array of names that seemed to, looked like they could have come from the same village, and so we went in and tried to corroborate that with the data that was there. And so I'll turn it over to Richard. One thing I always, I told Richard I would do is give him a little disclaimer before we start. Some of these names, in modern times, we have interpreted them a certain way, and they may not match up with what our research has shown as to what seems like the intent of that translation was from the original. So things get morphed over time. My own reservation, Campo, the Campo Valley was the big meadow. It was Mishkatai, and when the white settlers came in, they in the late 1880s they started putting Spanish names on everything, and they didn't know how to spell Mishkatai anyway. The ish sound is there's no English equivalent, so they wrote it Milquatai, and then later they changed it to Spanish. They actually translated it properly. They called it Campo, the countryside, in Spanish, when there's all the Mexicanization of a lot of the areas around here in the 1880s and 1890s. Then years later, people came back to Kumeyaay people. They looked at the old records and they saw the Milquatai, and they said, "What does the Milquatai mean?" And well, since it wasn't Mishkatai, they looked at Milquatai and they said, "Oh, that means Bigfoot." They said, "Well, maybe the valley is shaped like a Bigfoot, but it isn't really, but that any more than any valley is shaped like a Bigfoot." So then they said the Indian name for it means Bigfoot, and so you end up getting these distortions. So then Indian people actually did the translation, and they thought they were giving them the correct old name for it, and then that gets into the record, and so you see stuff like that happens. So sometimes some of the names that we have nowadays have gone through some iterations before they got to the present. So with that caveat, I will now turn it over to Mr. Carrico.
So to begin with, it's kind of interesting what we've already heard here this morning, and I want to reiterate some of that just in passing. My focus has been on colonial, if you will, Spanish and Native American Indigenous interactions going back, 30 years as I've been researching this. In fact, as was mentioned by a couple different folks, back in 1989, there was a big excavation done at Mission San Diego, and I was in charge of that mission, for better or for worse, that did. And one of the things that we did find there was congenital syphilis on an 8-year-old Native American child. So I'm going to try to pull some of the mission records together, and as Mike mentioned, there's going to be some disparity perhaps in translation or in pronunciation of those. Next slide. So I want to begin obviously with some acknowledgements for the California Mission Studies group itself and how it formed. And then I'll give a couple other things here, but one is certainly the different approaches that this team took. So mine is ethnographic and ethnohistory, a little archaeology. Margaret Field, Dr. Field, is a linguist, so she was looking at the Shimull, the clan names and the personal names and the place names in a linguistic way, and trying to say, well, if you look at this linguistically, here's what I think this means. That's how she was looking at it. Margaret has done a lot of work south of the border. The border we'd all like to erase, but it is out there. And so she's been working with Tipai people. And the pronunciation is a little different than it is north of the border, and it's a little different even as you move further north into San Diego County. So we could group the people together as Kumeyaay, and then break them down into Ipai on the north and Tipai on the south. So she, in looking at the records, one of the things that Margaret wanted to do is, can we differentiate the territory or the Shimulls of the Ipai-Tipai people based on the names in the mission records? And we believe we can. And there's also some archaeological differentiation. Mike was always great to bounce things off of and to give his input and talk about some of the creation stories and the travel stories in some of the oral traditions, and try to put places on the ground. And then the graduate student, Caitlin, got the unenviable task of trying to look at over 6,000 baptisms in the mission records. We stopped at about 4,300 because after that, the names were getting very confused by the priest, and the place names were being dropped out, and they were using just Spanish place names. So we may continue, but right now we've stopped at about 4,300 names out of about 6,300, something like that. And then you can see the rest of the acknowledgements. And one thing I definitely want to stress is, in my career, some of these people mentioned here at the bottom have certainly pushed me more towards looking at anthropology and archaeology as a study of humans and of human nature and of culture, not of stuff. So when people, now I introduce myself, and Lee Panish and I were kind of kidding about that, I say I'm a recovering archaeologist, meaning I'm trying to look at things differently than material culture per se. Next slide. So here were the goals. You can read them yourselves. I always tell my students, there's no reason to do a PowerPoint if you're going to read everything you put on the PowerPoint. So you can read this for yourself. But certainly the major thing was to try to define differences in personal names and Shimull names. And can we see some differences? And Margaret believes that we can. And then for what I wanted to do was try to map in and better clarify the probably 75 to 80 Kumeyaay villages that existed in San Diego County at one time, a population of about 20,000 indigenous people. And I want to stress this is for Kumeyaay, this does not cover the Luiseno at all. And it was brought up earlier, J.P. Harrington. So I've been reading J.P. Harrington for 30 years now, and for down here, I understand his code. He comes to me in my dreams, which is a frightening thought, but he's actually helped clarify some things sometimes. And so we've tried to fold some of the J.P. Harrington work together, which is about 2,400 pages, and the mission records. And then in short, we're trying to, if you will, put the people on the land. Not that you have ever left, or the Kumeyaay ever left, but to put it, as Paul was saying, so that for those curriculum, and so for the church and people who want to know more, we've got a database to work off of and say this, this is informed by oral tradition, it's informed by elders, but it's also informed by your very mission records. So take a look at these. Next slide, please. So, you know the answer to this question, but I used to start out some of my lectures with this and then go into how do we want to look at Mission San Diego. And by the way, if you happen to go there, and some of you might be taking the tour tomorrow with Stan, this is the 5th mission in Alta California. The first 2 were on Presidio Hill. But when you go here, the sign out front says California's first mission, and that's just another lie. It's the 3rd one, and it's not even that one. This is the 5th one. So there was a 3rd one, and the Kumeyaay people burned it to the ground and killed Father Jaime. Then there was another one, and then finally this one in 1805. So it's interesting when you take the tour, depending on which docents you get, they're a little more honest about what you're actually seeing. When they used to let me go here, they don't let me go there anymore, but when they used to let me on the grounds, they would take us in this church as a tour and say, Father Sarah walked these very tiles. Not true. He was way dead by 1805, but it's a good story, like all the other stories. Next slide. So here's what they provide. We were looking at baptismal records. So those of you that work with mission records, there's baptismal, there's death, and there's marriage records. And they bring different information to the table, if you will. Sometimes the marriage records give you a lot more about the parents of the bride and the groom, or the padrinos, the godfathers, who's there, all kinds of information. But the baptisms started early, 1771, because the first 2 years, no Kumeyaay were baptized. But 4 soldiers ran off to live with Indian women. So if this were a baseball score, it would be Padres nothing, Indians 4. Right? That's how you could look at it. So we're going from 1769 to 1835, and today, those of you that have done this research, you use the Huntington Library Project, and it's all been digitized. You can go there and you can sort it and do all kinds of things. When I started this 30 years ago, that's not the case, and I'm going to show you a couple pages out of the original documents. So now this is where we are, and we're looking at this type of information. And again, not just for raw information, we're trying to put the people with the families, with the clans, and back on the ground. Next slide. So this is what a baptismal record looks like. And as Mike mentioned, depending on the person writing it down and how literate they were and where they were from, Portugal, Spain, Italy, or even different parts of Mexico. So sometimes Vicente is spelled with a B, Vicente, because that's the dialect of that person doing the record. So as you go through it, you have to kind of understand which priest is doing this. I think we had a total of 12 priests at San Diego over the years. And so after a while, you get used to their handwriting. Next slide. So click it again and see what happens. There you go. Thank you. So what I've done here is I've enlarged this. And what this tells us, by the way, is one of the baptisms was at a village called Matamo. You are on Matamo right now. So while we could talk about acknowledging Kumeyaay land tenure, and we should, I want to acknowledge you're on the village of Matamo or Matamo right here. This golf course, the hills above us, for probably 3 square miles, was a very, very large village. And this is one of the villages that incited the riot or the rebellion in 1775 that led to the sacking of Mission San Diego, November 5th, the night of November 4th and 5th. So what I've highlighted there that's a little difficult to read on the screen, I suppose, is the person's name. And so the priest would say, on this day, I gave solemn baptism to, and then typically they would use the Kumeyaay name, Achille, might be the Kumeyaay name, now known as Juana Maria. So then they're going to give you the Spanish name, and with any luck, he'll say in the record, and the parents' names, and if they were converted, he'll give you the Spanish converted name and the native name. If they're not converted, it'll just give you what they call the pagan name or the gentile name, the native name. And then it'll say from the village of, and this one says Matamo, and you can fill in lots of blanks. And then later sometimes, if it's really neat, he'll say Matamo, Saracade, located near, and give you another village name. And you keep filling in the dots. You do this for 30 years, you can almost make sense out of it. Almost make sense out of it. Next slide. And we also have military records. So this gentleman, Fernando Rivera Moncada, was the commandant of the Presidio, because here in San Diego we have a Presidio and a mission. And he left a very good diary, all in Spanish, but it is printed. And he talks about life on the Presidio, and he talks about the people he's encountering. And one of the things that he says about the Kumeyaay, which was brought up yesterday, about why are there reservations in San Diego County and why are there still so many Kumeyaay? Because they resisted. As he said, they are insolent, they're treacherous, and they don't like us. Basically, they don't want to conform to us, even though we whip them and we beat them and we cajole them. They're not coming along. That's one of the answers, quite frankly. And by the way, he's killed 3 years after this diary ended on the Colorado River in the Kumeyaay rebellion. He and Father Garces and many other Spaniards were killed in 1781. Invaluable diary. So you take this diary, you take the baptism records, you take Harrington, you can put a lot of things together. Next slide. So one of the things that we had started on for another project is I've been working on a Kumeyaay ethnography for 7 years here, but this has helped. So these little pinpoints represent some of the Kumeyaay place names. And so as Mike mentioned, they've changed over time because they got Hispanicized or they got Anglicized or whatever. So these are just little dots. We're now up to about 425 on a Google map, and you can zoom in and you can go see these things. So again, part of what we'd like to do for schools and for the general public at some point, not for sacred sites, but that school could sit there in their classroom and see what Kumeyaay places were nearby, see what that valley was called that's behind the school. So for instance, a school was just named Nipawai here in San Diego County after the village, the Kumeyaay village of Nipawai. Wouldn't it be neat to sit there at that school and find out what the nearby place names were? And guess what? They're very similar to what's on the land. There's one up here, near where I live in Warner Springs, in a valley that we today call Ballena Valley, Whale Valley. The Kumeyaay name for that, depending on the pronunciation, was Ishpon, whale. So when the Spaniards got there, they said, what do you call this valley? And they said, Whale Valley. Well, why do you call it that? Well, because we found whale bone. And they did. They had a stool made out of a whale vertebrae. And plus the mountain behind looks like a whale. So we call this Whale Valley. They go, okay, we're going to call it Ballena. We'll get rid of that name. And then when the Americans came and pushed the Mexicans out, they said, what do you call this place? Well, we call it Ballena. Okay, we'll call it Whale Valley. So now when you drive through there, the name has never really changed. It just changed languages. And that's true for a lot of these. So we have places that are called Powai, which we call Poway. We have Otai. We have Hamun. We have Watai. So a lot of these places are still on the land, but I think one of our goals is to bring them back on the land even more. Next slide. So here are today's reservations, and one thing you'll notice is they're all quite inland. That's because the coastal land was largely depopulated during the mission, and then later the Mexican ranchos, and then the Americans pushed people further and further inland. Florence Shippick wrote a book called Pushed into the Rocks, and that's exactly right, pushed back into the rocks. But these village sites that are shown on here are just some of the 75 to 80 villages across San Diego County. And the next slide is some of those 40 villages. And we talked about some of these names already: Otai, Utai, Matamo, where we are right now at this moment, Hamishaw, having to do with a gourd. Next slide. So this map shows you the major villages that were that had baptisms during the mission period. And one thing I want to call your attention to, that there could be some disagreement on this, because it is history after all, but in the Spanish documents at least, those red dots, all of which are south of the San Diego River, are the villages that sacked the mission, because they had clan alliances that ran east-west. So one of the major clans was what's one I want to use? Metwar, strong, endurant, and they ran east-west. There were several others, Kumeyaay, the Waipoke. And so it is my belief, at least, and I'm finishing up a big article on this, that when the mission was being sacked, it was largely what I'm going to call Tipai. It was Southern people, because those were the alliances. Not that the people of the North didn't have grievances. There had been rapes, there had been killings, there had been at least 2 women from a village where Pacific Beach is today, the village of Hamo. 2 women had hanged themselves after being abused by soldiers. So there was terrible things going on to the North, but it looks like the push for the rebellion all came largely from the south because of alliances. Next slide. And then if we look at the villages, and I learned this from Randy Millikan, some of you know the great work he has done by trying to take things and use computers and programs and do some modeling. So the larger images there, different shapes, represent the number of people baptized. So one thing I want to stress, and it goes back to the victimization, is there's a very quick fall off as soon as you start going about 30 miles east, like right here from downtown San Diego. There were 20, 30 villages east of here that never had a baptism. We never saw a Spaniard. They're still going to be affected because of the diseases, the cattle grazing, all kinds of things. But when I hear about the Spanish came in and quote, colonized San Diego, they colonized a relatively narrow band along the coast. Once they got about here, and certainly back to Viejas, as they wrote in their own records, we don't want to go there. They attack us, and so they stayed where they felt safe. So who's controlling who in this time period? Next slide. So these are some of the Shimulls or clans. Many of these are parts of people's names today, where they're also places on the land. So the ones that have a blank in the far right, no, not the far right, the right-hand column, those did not show up in early records of anthropologists. So correctly, when Native people, Indigenous people look at the anthropological record and go, this guy, Gifford, Spear, Crower, they missed a lot. They missed this family, they missed this. That's because those men and women, Constance Du Bois, they were studying people on reservations 100 years after the fact, and those clans had disintegrated, or they simply chose not to tell that anthropologist what clan they were of, right? So you have that too. So if you look on the left hand, those are the ones that show up in mission records, and then the next column over shows those that have been previously recorded. So to me, one of the major contributions of this study is to rebuild, literally rebuild and remap clans that had been in the literature, maybe not in the oral tradition, not in the songs, but in the literature, forgotten or overlooked. Next slide. So this is a very rough map of the territory that these Shimulls controlled, or at least that they had family members of the different Shimulls of the different clans. So the anthropological system down here, if you will, the social system, was the clan was extremely strong. More so than the village, than a single village leader. The clans were extremely important, made up of different families. So you can see sort of the territory here. And the largest one is a village, or a clan, called Metor. And it goes all the way from up the coast near Mesa Grande, inland Mesa Grande, almost down to the border, far east, and all the way to the coast. A very, very large clan, and they're involved in just about everything that took place in San Diego in the Spanish period. Some of you might know about Sino Duro from Mesa Grande. He was a Metor. Next slide. So one of the things that Margaret asked me to do, especially during COVID, was go out and drive around and photograph the villages, because you know where a lot of them are. So this is the village of Pamu, which is up in Ramona. It's a beautiful area. Originally, this valley, 12 years ago, this valley was slated for a golf course and 400 homes. And now it's all open space. The county ultimately made the guy's life so miserable because of all the archaeological sites and the biological and the gnat catcher that he gave up and sold it to the county. So this is now part of a 2,000-acre preserve called the Ramona Grasslands. This is the village of Pamu. It was attacked in 1778 by Spanish soldiers. They brought back 9 sets of ears. That's part of what they were supposed to do. They burned people to death in their houses when they refused to come out. And speaking of history, and the truth in history, which is what this conference is about, and the papers we've been working on, is it got into the literature that 4 leaders, 4 cabecillas, 4 leaders, Kumeyaay, from this village were captured. They were taken back to the Presidio, whipped, 5 days, 20 azotes a day, 20 lashes a day for 5 days, then resting for 2 days, then 5 more days, 20 lashings, And one of them ultimately died in the prison there, and is buried there because he took baptism at the last minute. So going back to that issue, does that mean they converted? No, just because they're in the baptism record doesn't mean they converted. I went to Sunday school, right? And I'm certainly not a Christian, so how well does that work? But in the literature, it got that 3 of these men were then executed. Bancroft, the historian of California, says these 3 men were executed, and he gives the day. And then, unfortunately, some other people, relying on secondary sources, Bancroft, repeat that mistake. They were not executed. Ultimately, they were pardoned, and they went back to their village and told the Spaniards, if you ever come up here again, we will kill you next time. So, bringing some truth to the table. The mountain there in the background, by the way, is Mount Woodson, one of the sacred peaks for the Kumeyaay people. And that little notch off to the left of the mountain is where a mythical creature, a story keep creature, a wonder person, Tochipe, came through walking from the desert, from the Colorado River, and when he stepped right there, it indented the ground. And if you go up there, there's a very large rock, twice the size of this room, and you can in fact see his footprint. It's in that rock. His next step, by the way, was Mount La Jolla. That's how large this gentleman was. So there's still lots of stuff on the land. Next slide. So Hamo is, if you know San Diego, it's Pacific Beach, right where Balboa comes down the hill and crosses what's now Highway 5. It used to be a drive-in theater when I was growing up, but before that, it was a village, and the drive-in theater simply paved over it. And there has been archaeological work done here way back in the 70s, and we got a date of 4,500 years, and that wasn't the bottom. That's just where we have things we could date. So that's Hamo. And then below that is Istawa. That's in Sereno Valley, right by the coaster station. It shows up in the mission records. It's one of the most heavily baptized villages. And many of those people ended up at the mission. Nippawai, if you go to the mission tomorrow with Stan, you'll be standing on Nippawai, which probably means the other place. Some people think that's what the name means. It's where the San Diego River comes through the valley right there. And then Iguay is up in the Cuyamaca Mountains, east of here, right outside the boundary of the state park, but it's all in an open space. So the villages are still out there. And I didn't want to bore you with slide after slide after slide, but we've been able to photograph about 30, 35 of the villages so far. Yeah. So the homelands, they're still there. It's still out there. Next slide, please. I'm watching my clock here. Okay. So you can certainly read this for yourself, but the point of it is, and I've been trying to stress this the last 10 or 15 years in my classes, is to not speak about Indigenous people in general in the past tense, and also to reduce the victimization, not to not talk about it, not to say terrible things happened, because absolutely they did, but there are more to humans than the terrible things that have happened to them. And I think we've already been talking about that. It's a lot more about persistence. It's about cultural traditions. It's about the bird songs. It's about revitalization. So I would go to the bottom here and say that, as we've seen here, and if you go to any of the gatherings here and probably throughout California, you see that flame is still out there, right? It's in the hearts of the people. It's in the ancestors. It's in the ground. When I woke up this morning and walked around the golf course, I acknowledged to myself, I'm walking on Matamo. I've read about it, I've studied it, I even did some archaeology out here, but the vibe is still out there. It is still out there. So it remains. Next slide. So that is my last slide. This happens to be a submerged village. So you might have heard about a village called El Capitan Grande or Capitan Grande, also known as Quilamac, not Cuyamaca, but Quilamac. And it's under a lake, it's under a reservoir. People were driven out and the valley was flooded. One group moved to Verona, one group moved to Viejas, and a very small group took a one-time check and moved elsewhere. But that village is still under there. If you get a kayak and you go out in the middle and you look 87 feet down, the village is still there, as you are. Thank you.
So I I should introduce myself. I'm Matthew Fruit, or Matt, and I am an archaeologist. I am at Arizona State University, but until last year, or this year, I was at Santa Clara University. And so my presentation, my discussion is going to be about the work I was doing while I was there, along with a bunch of collaborators, one of whom is here. And so while it's my name on the program, this is basically I'm summarizing a chapter we're writing together for the Handbook of Critical Mission Studies. And so you can see all the collaborators on this chapter below. And so what we're basically we're talking about is, it's really wonderful to hear all this information. And we've worked with people who are very knowledgeable, have lots of information that we're producing, but what we really wanted to sort of describe in the chapter is the process we went through in that collaboration and how we're hoping and finding a little bit of evidence that we're impacting, we're getting that information out and impacting the world and changing how the institution of Santa Clara University, and we're hoping even further beyond that, deals with these issues. And so it's a sort of how-to guide on a certain level is what this is all about. So let's go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of this work was done in Ohlone land. We worked with members of the Ohlone tribe and the Ohlone Indian tribe. And also that we are here in Sapan, and I think it's really wonderful to be able to do a land acknowledgement in native land here. So I thank Sapan for the opportunity to be here. Next slide, please. And so the title of our project was Teaching Ohlone History, Changing Public Memory. And so you can understand that a lot of what we were trying to do was translate work that had happened already, archaeological, historical, cultural work, and also the work of Ohlone people themselves, who are many of our partners in this and our collaborators, into things that then sort of made it further out into public consciousness. So a big part of that was the classes we teach at Santa Clara University. The vast majority of the students who come in, I think a large chunk of students come from California. So they've had some semblance of mission history, but that mission history, as covered by so many papers here, so many discussions, is very, very, problematic. It's wrong. It's not telling the truth. And, they come onto a campus which is, as was sort of said here, it's one giant play mission project and trying to reframe how they look at what has been this beautiful campus that they all very greatly enjoy and understand what the history is behind all those choices. And so it's about teaching in our classroom, but then also trying to develop products that can be taught in classrooms beyond Santa Clara University, at other universities, and even in younger ages as well. And so that's what the idea here of the title is. It's like, how do we use the skills we have as professors, as Ohlone community members, all the different ways that we have to reach other people. How do we take those and start changing what is being said out there? Okay, next slide. And so to do this, we can go to the next slide. We've currently developed one thing that actually has been pretty cool. People have had a pretty good response to, which is taking Google Earth, which is just basically an online internet site where it's like a giant map of the entire Earth, and you can fly around and do all kinds of cool stuff in it. It's a lot like Google Maps. And what we did is it allows you to lay over projects that you create. And we laid over a project that was essentially a walking tour, largely developed by the candidates over there, of Santa Clara University campus, focusing on the Ohlone history of what is today's Santa Clara University campus. A major part of which is, I should say, Mission Santa Clara. So Mission Santa Clara was founded actually not on our campus, Mission, just like in San Diego. And after a couple of iterations that got destroyed, ends up the third mission structure ends up on the Santa Clara University campus. That gets destroyed. There's a fourth mission, then there's a fifth mission. That actually burns down in the 1920s, and then they rebuild this massive steel concrete, highly expanded mission. church, but there is still like other parts of the mission that are there, including cemeteries where thousands upon thousands of people are buried. And every time they do anything from planting a tree to building a new building, they run into materials from the mission era. But in addition to that, there is also a long history, thousands of years earlier, of villages, of ancestral burials, of all kinds of activities that are also encountered. And so it sort of goes through, and you can take the walking tour of the campus that is sort of modeled on the tours that they give prospective students. And you go and you actually learn about the deeper history of Ohlone people on that campus and a little bit of it as well. And so that's already up. You can go check it out anytime on the Santa Clara University Community Heritage Lab website. And then you go to the next slide. Yes. How'd you get cut off here? Well, I guess I'll just talk. All right. That's okay. We're also currently developing a website that, not sure why that happened, but I have a long presentation if you want to see on my computer at some later point. That is basically going to be put up and out in the public at Santa Clara University on their website. I think the idea right now is to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And we'd initially thought of it as sort of just developing resources for any instructor who wanted to include Ohlone culture, Ohlone history in their classroom. We would provide them with a set of resources that were developed by the leaders of the Ohlone tribe and the Ohlone Indian tribe. And so that website has expanded to just sort of broader information plus those curricular resources and teaching materials. And so that'll be up, I think, pretty soon. And we're hopeful that people will be able to check it out, learn a bunch more. But I guess talk a little more about that. What we wanted to do was then also say, okay, well, we've done this stuff and we've gotten a little feedback. We know. So the Office of Diversity and Inclusion has said, hey, this is great. Let's start including this within the broader, administration of the university. We've seen it, we've had a little feedback on our tour. A couple of people wanted to include it on their websites, all kinds of things like that. And so we say, like, okay, how did we do this? How did we sort of get things going for anyone who wants to do the same kind of thing? Let's say you have interest in changing how your local university or your local high school, your local organization deals with these sorts of issues. What do you do? And so we went through and we sort of had these conversations amongst us, and I did a very formal set of interviews, and we started pulling out all the information that people have provided us and writing up this chapter. And I think, there's a few lessons that I just kind of wanted to share, and I'm happy to talk more about it if people have questions about the specific procedures we followed and those kinds of things later. So the most important thing, though, to emphasize here is, right, I'm like one of the collaborators on this, but a lot of the other collaborators are like second, third generation working on this, have been pounding the pavement for decades and decades, highly experienced folks, leadership in tribal communities who have really been the ones who have pushed all of this. And so they came with a lot of background, having already, worked with or worked on Santa Clara University and doing what they could. And so I think that that is a real key here, is understanding that, this insistence on continuing to work, as one of our collaborators says, like, always answer the phone call if someone wants to do something, answer the phone call, figure out whether it's going to help you out as a tribal community. Also, insist, if you see something you want done, don't say it one time and let it be. We had people telling stories about how they visited Santa Clara University High School, now they're in their 60s, and still working on the same things they were thinking about, 40 some odd years ago. And so also then leveraging their political power and saying, it's not enough to just say, oh, it's wonderful, we have these great partners, these folks who are at Santa Clara University who seem to care, because, like, for example, me, I left Santa Clara University, right? So I'm not going to be able to have the same impact going forward that I may have had previously. And so just the idea of insisting on native-led political power as the thing that is at the forefront of everything we do. The central goal here is sovereignty. Sovereignty in all its different forms, whether it's decision-making authority, whether it's, we have one collaborator, she's a rhetoric professor, and she talks about rhetorical sovereignty, the right to tell your own story and not have that story be told by other people. And so we always try and use that concept of sovereignty as what guides us through this. And so, some of the things that we had that people were saying is, it really, really helps to have this relationship go on beyond a single project. That you collaborate with an institution, with an individual, and you just keep it going so that the Native folks get to be the leading voice from the beginning. The institution doesn't get to decide when it starts and when it stops. Native folks are the ones who make those decisions. And so I think some of the people who are still at Santa Clara University were very smart in that they're now starting to institute basically monthly or bi-monthly meetings where we work on all these different projects that we're working on, because we've now expanded well beyond the critical mission studies project to a series of internal grants, a National Endowment for the Humanities grant led by Amy Luke, the rhetoric professor. And Lee Panic has been working on this all the way through this. So we've had all these long-term relationships, and through that, it really has shifted who gets to make the decisions on any given project. As long as the Native community is in constant contact and in constant collaboration with the university, they have much more ability to speak out and say, this is what needs to happen, this is how we should do it. And so the chapter is sort of discussing some of those impacts that we saw, including greater openness and honesty, the ability to come back to things, greater trust, co-learning the process together. A lot of our especially the Mwekma tribal community is talking about how, they've had to learn to navigate Santa Clara University's administration. They aren't members of the administration. So keeping those projects going for multiple years now across multiple different things that we're doing has really helped them understand better how to work with the administration and those kinds of things. I wish my presentation had been up there so I could sort of go through all the different bullet points. But I think those are the main highlights. And just sort of the idea is here, check out the chapter when it comes out. We have a lot of stuff embedded in little lessons that we've had, but that's the whole point of what we're trying to provide here, is a sort of a guide or a helpful guide for anyone who wants to get engaged in that work. So a big part of that can also be, if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them right now too.
Thank you, Matthew.
Question for you. The Mudson and the Ohlone are the same people, right? They're just different villages, but they're... Because I think that when I see some of these things like that, where the people there need to come together as a nation, because that's what we did down here in the South, is that we came together as a nation. So today, when we look, we have different groups that we have a repatriation group that the 12 tribes belong to. And what we do is, what we've been trying to tell our people is that, look, we know that our reservations right today are put together, and they're scattered from different people, from different clans, and different things that were put together. So we know that people live all over. So what we're trying to do is go back and say, this is our territory. And that we're not looking, well, it's closer to my reservation, so we should have a say here. We're saying, no, if it's on your reservation, okay, then we'll say, you take care of it. But if it's off, then it belongs to all of us. And then, so that's how we've been able to move and do a lot of different things within, and also I think too that there's a lot of things that our people are not doing. For instance, here at at UCSD, they had some remains that were 9,000 years old in there. They were trying to say that, well, they're not your people. There was a court case already that went through the Supreme Court with the Kittiwake Man, where the tribes are lost. Well, when we fought our battle, and our attorneys kept telling us the same thing, it already went through, you're not going to win. When we got to the Ninth Circuit, we actually won, and then the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to hear it. So we ended up winning. And part of that was because we were sitting there praying, and we fasted, and we were saying that we were going to get these things back. Even though there was a case already went through the Supreme Court, they lost. They were saying the same thing was going to happen to us. But because we were able to come together, and then what we also did was got the Ninth Circuit to start saying the Kumeyaay Nation. Not just the Kumeyaay, but they were now recognized as a nation, this court. So that's what some of those tribes up there with the Ohlone there, they have to come together and quit looking at just the villages, but start looking at the people as a whole, and then start that fight and say, now, together we're going to stand together. We're not just looking at just our villages, but we're looking at us as a nation, as our people.
Yeah, I think that is a very important comment. There's a lot of challenges in the San Francisco Bay Area that made that very hard, but that is one of the goals of our project. So you'll notice we do have a couple of different communities we're working with, and those are the communities who can trace their ancestry through the mission on the campus of Santa Clara University. The other big challenge, though, is there are no federally recognized tribes in the San Francisco Bay Area, I shouldn't say Bay Area, but in the southern Bay Area where Santa Clara is located. In the northern Bay Area, but not in the southern Bay Area. And so it has made it really, really hard for collaboration. Now, I will say it's not for me to say, right? Like, this is not my choice. I'm not native. I don't. So what we are trying to do is be as inclusive as possible and have the products we produce benefit everyone in the area. And that is a really key part, because I think, I hear exactly what you're saying. And I have seen enormous benefits. So right now I'm located in the Phoenix area. And we see this very similar kind of idea. They have a consortium of tribes who deal together with cultural resources and things like that, and so that they can, say, yeah, we aren't pitted against each other. We've been able to work together and do what's best for us. And I think it would be wonderful. I think many people are of that opinion. I think that there are real challenges that people are facing that I'm not alone, right? I can't say this is what you should do. But yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying.
I have a question for Matt. On the first slide, you showed who participated in the project, and I saw Andrew Galvin. I didn't recognize any other names as Ohlone tribal people. Did you have any Ohlone on this project?
Yeah, so go back to the slide, but off the top of my head, so Charlie Nejme is the chairwoman of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. Monica Ariano is the vice chairwoman. Sheila Guzman, who is a board member for Muwekma Ohlone. And then Andy Galvin of the Ohlone Indian tribe, and Desiree Bighill of the Ohlone Indian tribe. And so, I'm trying to think of who else. James Irwin of the Ohlone Indian tribe. I think we're the ones who are involved primarily in this discussion, but we've had other collaborations, but it's from those two communities, those two organizations, Muwekma and Ohlone Indian tribe.
The reason I asked is because Andy Galvin is employed by the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
He is at Mission Dolores.
Yes.
So you mentioned that we should fight for what we want and what our desires are, but when you're dealing with people who are actually of that faith and have embraced the colonized religion and so forth, I would have to say that I don't trust them to make the best decisions for Native people. So that's why I asked. And Andrew Galvin, it'd be a direct conflict of interest, being that he is employed by the Catholic Church. And I've seen him monitor sites out of his area as well for the church. So I would be hard pressed to think that he would be in the best interest of the people.
I mean, I think that this is, and it ties well with what's being said here, is that I think that what we strive for is for our products to be able to benefit everyone who participates, and that's why we try and be as inclusive, because there are indeed multiple competing and often clashing interests within communities. And it's one of the biggest challenges, and I think that it is something we've really worked hard with. It is not to say that we haven't had conflicts in our projects nonstop, but I think that's why we always set the goal of sovereignty first, and if, as non-native collaborators, we're going to be producing anything that is sort of speaking to native lives in any way, impacting native lives in any way, we have to be providing benefits to everyone who is impacted. And so if that, you can't, one voice, but one voice can't come to dominate, or because there are these competing interests. And so what we hope is that, okay, there are plenty of things we've thought of as wonderful ideas that have been shot down by one or two of our collaborators because they disagree with it. And we said, okay, what we have to figure out is how do you navigate these competing interests, and it is native sovereignty. That's the goal ultimately. So I hear what you're saying, and I'd definitely be interested in hearing more what you have to say too.
Yes.
I'm curious, how do you prepare an institution like Santa Clara University, or the people in Santa Clara University, the power that exists there, to be equipped to be able to come to the table responsibly and accountably? Like, what prep work do you have, what might have been done so that those conversations would actually be succeed?
It's a challenge. I still am very vaguely skeptical. But I do think that, and I think this is an important point that I forgot to mention, because I did not have my slideshow to guide me in my thoughts here. Students were the ones who did it. They paid tuition, and when students really started caring, when it took a sort of solidarity beyond the native student community, that all the students had to start caring, and that was really the moment when the university was pushed in some way to deal with it. And they did so through developing what they call the Ohlone Working Group to look at the physical campus and how they might alter it to be less, violent to those who walk through it. And but what we then did is we started with that work, and that's sort of the point of what I was talking about. Is that was the a beginning there that really allowed for multiple other projects to keep going and pushing. Until the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which one could imagine could be a way of pushing these issues off to the side and saying, "Oh, look, we have an administrative office, but it's not very empowered." So I don't know how that'll turn out over the long term, but I think that we just decided, each of us has our own power, right? So the Ohlone community member leaders, they have political power. They do, and they play essential roles in the development projects at the university. They also have political skills and connections beyond, what the university says. The slide I was going to show is, they're in ceremonies with the mayor of San Jose or the mayor of Santa Clara. So they do have these connections. And then we as instructors, we have a classroom. And I could reach when I was there, 40 students every year with a large section on the history of the Santa Clara University campus. And so if we all work together doing what we could in raising consciousness and trying to get students in solidarity with the Ohlone communities in what they were pushing the university for. But yeah, it was, I will say, if it's ever a university, it's the students who often have the most power, especially private universities where they're so dependent on tuition. That is.
Okay, we have a question here for Richard.
Hi, Richard. I got a chance to talk to you a little bit, for a brief moment last night, to learn a little bit about your work. I love what you're doing. I wish we could do that for our territory. This morning I said we had 84 villages or tribes taken to Mission Santa Cruz. They were, Lutsen, Greater Ohlone, other Ohlone tribes who spoke different languages. The Yokots from the valley. And we even had Maidu and Molo taken to Mission San Juan Bautista. And that's what those 84 village sites were. So if you look for linguistic similarities or looking to apply linguistic translations to the village skills, you'd have to go to all those other languages. I often ask the question, how do we find out where these 84 village sites are now on the map? And everybody says there is no record, is no record. Is it possible to somehow, make sure that you're giving the best effort possible to find those records and to get those sites mapped?
I think you could. I mean, I'm saying that very cavalier, but I think you could by doing the same thing, looking at the baptismal, marriage, and death records. And a lot of times, again, they'll either mention another village, or they'll say the parents are from, and then they'll give a different village that they might be living at right then. And you just keep putting dots on a map, and then reading other Spanish documents, maybe place names. I mean, one of the things we're blessed with here, besides still having all the different tribes that we do, is a lot of the place names have been, as Mike mentioned, misconstrued. But maybe it shows up in a mission record, and then you linguistically look at it and you go, oh, it's that one. And then you put that dot on that map. It's a lot of, I would not want to try it for your groups because you've got so much variance. But for instance, 8 or 10 of the baptisms at Mission San Diego were actually from Baja California, Cochimí, from San Fernando de Velacata, and a couple of others were from Sonora. Native people brought up from Sonora, and their names stuck out because they look so different. Yeah.
If we were going to try to find someone who could help us there, would it be best to look for an archaeologist, a linguist, a magician? What would be best?
Yeah, a magician would be good. Probably a spiritual person who could go into the past. Is anyone up there studying Harrington's notes, J.P. Harrington's notes?
We do a lot of that.
That's a good beginning. I mean, once you figure out his code, he wasn't doing it, as people thought, because he hated Kroger. There's reason to hate Kroger, but he wasn't doing it for that reason. He was just writing in shorthand. And so some of you that have done Harrington knows that as he's writing, he'll say in English, so today I went out with Angel Quilt, and we went to this valley, and I asked Angel what it was called, except at that point he switches to Spanish, and he'll say, dicho, Angel, da-da-da-da-da-da, and then Angel answers in Kumeyaay, so then he writes it in Kumeyaay, and then he asked Angel in Spanish what that plant is. Angel gives him the answer, and he writes it in Latin. So it's not that it's a code, it's the way that man's mind worked.
And he was also educated in Germany, so he has...
and he switches to German.
He has a German notation too that he throws in there.
Yeah.
Then he did different when he recorded things south of the border. he used much more heavily into Spanish notation. So it's kind of...
But I guess the answer would be, ideally, I would think, from my perspective, it would be a historian, a linguist, and if you can get either somebody who does ethnographies or who could look at Harrington's notes, and because you have to, it's like listening to a bird song, or it's like listening to an oral tradition story. You have to keep peeling it back and teasing out those things that he said. I mean, I've literally spent 30 years looking at Harrington's notes. And I almost understand it. And sometimes, by the way, his maps are backwards for reasons I haven't figured out, but he kept talking in this one document about this village and this pictograph that was there, and every time I read it, it made no sense. I knew where he started. He started at the village of San Pasqual in San Pasqual Valley, and I know when he got to Escondido, so somewhere between there and there, 15 miles, it was making no sense. I know this is all going to sound fuzzy-wuzzy, but one night Harrington came to me in a dream, and I apologize for my language, he said, it's fucking backwards. And it was 3 in the morning, so I jumped up out of bed, I found my Xerox copy of it, held it up to the mirror, and it was backwards. So,
Did he hit you on the head when he said that?
yeah. Well, no, my wife did. She said, "Why are you up? You just came to bed an hour ago." And I said, "Harrington spoke to me," and she goes, "Right." Yeah. So there you have it. Yeah, good luck.
Anyone else?
Richard or Mike, when you showed your map of the different villages, is it a artifact of your particular project that they're all north of the current border, or was there actually a distinction between who was being baptized at Mission San Diego that kind of mirrors that line?
The map that showed the villages that was most readable, I think might have had Vallejo and maybe Tijuana, because it's not Tijuana on it. The bigger map that you probably couldn't read and that I'm working with for the Kumeyaay ethnographic, it has several villages south, but basically very few baptisms were from what's now south of the border, because those were being done at La Misión at the next mission down, that I think Stan's going to take you to tomorrow if you go on that tour.
The agreement between the Franciscans and the Dominicans put the boundary almost where the international border is right now. It actually goes through downtown Tijuana is the parallel that they said everything south was supposed to be for the Dominicans. But there you find evidence of few crossovers.
Yeah. And Lee wouldn't tell you this, probably unsolicited, but he's been doing great work down in Baja California on some of the projects down there, and working with ENA and really trying to kind of erase that border a little bit and pull things back together. Good job.
He has some really fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
Great. So in Baja Catalina, that was a great story.
Yeah. One of our colleagues, Antonio Porcayo at Michelini, just wrote an article on a giant boat that they found in a sand dune down in Baja California, and got dates on it, and it's Sequoia juniper or pine? I can't remember. I read it late last night. So it came from way up north, probably. Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah, the Catalina mission was produced. It actually was one of the few missions where you had Christianized Indians. They were abandoned by the Spanish, so they actually ended up in alliances with the pagan Indians, and they fought in battles against the missions down along the coast. So just imagine how just crazy sometimes. Anyone else? Anyone hungry? Yeah. All right, thank you guys.